The conference room was on the 11th floor of a glass building downtown, and the first thing I noticed when I walked in was that no one had touched the water. There were 6 bottles sweating on a tray in the middle of the long table, capped, untouched. The kind of detail you only register when a room is bracing itself for something. My mother was already seated. She had on the navy blazer she wore to funerals and to the bank, and she did not stand up when I came in. Beside her sat a man I had never met, in a gray suit, with a leather folder open in front of him and a single sheet of paper turned face down near his right hand. I had been told this was a family meeting. That was the word my aunt had used on the phone. Family meeting, said warmly. Said the way you would say it about choosing a headstone together or deciding who would host the holidays. Now that my grandmother was gone, I had believed it, or I had wanted to believe it badly enough, that I drove 40 minutes downtown and paid for parking and rode an elevator up 11 floors to sit across from people who had decided, long before I arrived, exactly what they needed from me. My sister Audra was there, at the far end, with her husband Pierce. Neither of them looked at me directly. They looked at the table, at their phones, at the window, the way people do when they have agreed to be present for something they do not want to be seen doing. "Wren," my mother said. "Sit down, this won't take long." I sat. The man in the gray suit introduced himself as Dennis Frawley. He said he represented my mother. He said it pleasantly, the way you might announce the weather, and then he slid the face-down page across the polished table until it stopped in front of me, and he turned it over with 2 fingers. It was a signature line. Above it, a paragraph of small, dense print I did not need to read, because Dennis Frawley was already telling me what it said. "This is a transfer and release," he said. "It returns the assets your grandmother left in your name to your mother, who is, after all, the natural heir of her own mother's estate. You sign here, and the family avoids a great deal of unpleasantness and expense. It's clean, it's quick, everyone goes home." I did not pick up the pen. My mother leaned back in her chair and folded her hands in her lap and smiled at me. I want to be precise about that smile, because I had spent 37 years learning to read it. It was not nervous. It was not pleading. It was the smile of a woman who believed the matter was already settled and was simply waiting for me to catch up to a conclusion she had reached for both of us. "Be a good girl, Wren," she said. "For once." And Dennis Frawley, in his even, pleasant voice, gave me the rest of it. "I'll be direct, since we're all adults. Sign the inheritance over, or we'll take it to court. Your mother is prepared to allege undue influence. You were alone with an elderly, declining woman for years. You managed her medications, you drove her to her appointments. A court will find that very interesting. Most people in your position would rather not have their name attached to that kind of proceeding, so the offer is simple. Sign, or we file." He sat back, satisfied. My mother kept smiling. Audra studied the grain of the table. The room hummed with the particular fluorescent silence of a place built for surrender, and they all waited for me to understand that I had already lost. I did not argue. I had stopped arguing with my mother a long time before that afternoon, somewhere in my 20s, when I finally understood that arguing was a game she could only win, because the prize she was playing for was my participation in it. So I did not push the page back. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain to Dennis Frawley that I had not managed anything, that I had simply answered the phone for 6 years while everyone else let it ring. I took my phone out of my bag and I set it on the table, face up, and I dialed one number and I pressed the speaker button so the whole room could hear it ring. My mother's smile did not vanish all at once. It went in stages. First the certainty left it, then the warmth, and what was left was just the shape of a smile held in place by muscle memory while she tried to work out who I could possibly be calling, here, now, at the moment of her victory. The phone rang twice into the silent room. I want to tell you who answered, and what she said, and how a single phone call ended something my mother had spent 4 months building. But to understand why it ended the way it did, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand who I am, and who my grandmother was, and what she quietly built, while everyone in that conference room was busy deciding I was a thief. So let me go back. My name is Wren, and I am a hospice nurse. I have been one for 14 years. I tell people that, and I watch their faces do a small, involuntary thing, a flinch, a softening, sometimes a kind of awe that I do not deserve, because they imagine my days are made of grief, and they are not. My days are made of small mercies, a pillow turned to the cool side, a dose timed so that a man can be lucid for his daughter's visit and comfortable after she leaves, a window opened because someone misses the smell of rain, I sit with people in the last rooms of their lives, and I sit with the families who circle those rooms, and over 14 years, I have learned more about families than I ever wanted to know. Here's the thing I learned that mattered most, the thing that was running quietly under everything that happened in that conference room. People show you who they are at the end. Not at weddings, not at holidays, not in the photographs. At the end, when there is a body in a bed that still has warmth in it, and a house, and an account, and a set of car keys and a wedding ring, and the people who loved that body, or said they did, have to decide what they are in the presence of those things. I have watched sons I would have trusted with my life turn into strangers over a watch. I have watched a daughter who had not visited in 3 years arrive within an hour of the death with a moving truck. I have also watched the opposite, the quiet ones, the ones who stayed, get up from the bedside and walk out with nothing and not seem to notice they had nothing, because they had already gotten the only thing they came for. There was a man on my ward, a few years before my grandmother died, who I think about often. He had built a small trucking company over 40 years, and he was dying of something slow, and he had 3 grown children. For the 2 weeks I cared for him, those 3 children sat in his room in a kind of armed truce, and I watched the conversation never once be about him. It was about the company and the house at the lake, and a boat narrated in the careful, wounded language people use when they are fighting and pretending not to. He knew. The dying always know. He caught my eye one afternoon while his daughter was on the phone in the hallway negotiating something, and he said, so quietly only I could hear it, that he had spent his whole life building things for people who were now just waiting for him to stop breathing so they could divide them. Then he asked me to close the door, not to keep them out, to give himself a few minutes where he was a person again instead of an estate. I closed the door. He died 4 days later, and I do not know what happened to the company or the boat, and I have thought more than once that the kindest thing I did for that man in 2 weeks was give him a closed door and 20 quiet minutes of being more than what he would leave behind. I did not know then that I was learning the shape of my own family. But I was. I knew this script before my mother ever cast me in it. That was my advantage, though it did not feel like one at the time. When Dennis Frawley slid that page across the table, I was not shocked. I was tired in a very old and specific way. The way you are tired when something you have always known would happen finally arrives on schedule. My friend Odette, who has worked the same ward as me for 9 years, said it best a few weeks before the meeting when I told her my mother had hired a lawyer. We were standing in the medication room at 2 a.m, and I was crying in the small, contained way you learn to cry at work, where it does not interrupt anything. You didn't take anything, Wren, she said. You answered the phone. That's the whole crime. You answered the phone for 6 years, and now they want to charge you for it. She was right. That was the whole crime. In my family's telling, I had wormed my way into my grandmother's house. I had isolated her. I had managed her. The way Dennis Frawley said it, as if managing a dying woman's medications were a con and not a job. My actual job, the one I went to school for and have done at the bedsides of strangers for 14 years. In their telling, I was a calculating woman who had spent years cultivating an old lady for her house. In the truth, I was the one who showed up. That was all. And I've come to understand that showing up, when no one expects anything of you, when there is genuinely nothing in it for you, is the one thing certain families cannot forgive because it makes a quiet accusation they cannot bear to hear. To understand the accusation, you have to understand the house I grew up in, which was my mother's house, and the house I grew up loving, which was my grandmother's. They were 40 miles and an entire climate apart. I was the older daughter, born in the spring of 1989. My sister Audra came 3 years later, in the winter of 1992, and from the very beginning, the household organized itself around her. I do not say this with the heat I once said it with. I say it the way I would chart a patient's history, because it is simply the record. Audra's report cards went on the refrigerator. Mine went into a drawer, not thrown away. My mother was never cruel in ways you could photograph, just filed. The way you file something you have no particular use for, but do not feel right discarding. When there was money for one good thing, it followed Audra. When there was attention to give, it followed Audra. I learned early that the way to survive in my mother's house was to need as little as possible, to be the daughter who caused no trouble, and I got so good at it that I made myself nearly invisible, and then I resented being unseen, which is a trap that takes a long time to understand you are inside of. My father, Warren, was a kind man and a quiet one, and he loved me, I believe that. But he had long ago made a private peace with my mother that required him not to notice certain things, and so he did not notice them. He died in the autumn of 2015, a heart attack in the garage on an ordinary Saturday, and when he was gone, the last soft counterweight in that house went with him, and the family tilted fully and finally toward Audra, and I stopped going home except for the occasions you cannot skip without it becoming a story. But there was the other house. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was named Cordelia Ainsley, and her house was a white clapboard place at the end of a gravel road, with a screen door that announced everyone who came through it and a porch that faced an open field that went gold in August. I spent every summer there as a child. My mother sent me, I think, because it was one fewer child to manage, and Audra usually stayed home because Audra found the country boring, and so by an accident of who was unwanted where, I got my grandmother almost entirely to myself. She was not a warm woman in the way greeting cards mean it. She was dry and exact, and she did not hand out praise. But she saw me. That is the only way I know to say it. At my mother's table, I was a problem to be managed. At my grandmother's table, I was simply a person who had arrived, and that was the whole of it. She did not need me to be less so that someone else could be more. She let me take up the space I took up. The first time I understood that a person could simply be glad I existed, with nothing attached to the gladness. I was 9 years old, and we were shelling peas on her porch, and she said, without looking up, "You're good company, Wren. You always have been." I have held on to that sentence for nearly 30 years. It cost her nothing, and it rebuilt something in me. When she began to decline, in 2019, I was the one who came. It was not a decision so much as a current I stepped into. I was a nurse. I lived closest by then, in the small city, an hour from her road. My mother had a busy life, and Audra had small children, and I had the one thing the family did not value, which was the willingness to drive out on a Tuesday because a prescription needed picking up. So I drove out on Tuesdays, and then on Thursdays, and then most weekends. For 6 years, I managed her care the way you manage the care of someone you love and happen to know how to keep comfortable. I set up her medications in the weekly trays. I drove her to the cardiologist 40 minutes each way and sat in the waiting room and translated what the doctor said into language that let her sleep that night. I learned which nights she got frightened, and I started staying over on those nights, in the narrow bed in the back room that had been mine every summer. I remember one night in particular, in the winter of 2022, when she spiked a fever and got frightened and confused in the way the elderly do at 3 a.m, when the body's small rebellions feel like the end of the world. I drove the hour out on ice. I sat with her until the fever broke near dawn, holding a cool cloth to the back of her neck, telling her the names of the birds that would come back to the field in spring, because naming things she loved was the surest way to bring her back to herself. Around 5, she came clear, and she looked at me, embarrassed, and said she was sorry to have dragged me out. I told her there was nowhere else I would rather be at 5 a.m, which was true, and which sounds like a thing you say and was not. She was quiet a while. Then she said, into the dark, that she had called my mother first, earlier before me, and my mother had not picked up, and had texted back in the morning to say she had been asleep and was sure it was nothing. She said it without bitterness, just reporting the weather of her own life. I did not say anything, but I think that was the night, or one of the nights, that finished a calculation my grandmother had been running for a long time, the one that ended in an envelope at a lawyer's office. She was not a sentimental woman. She kept accounts. And she had noticed, across years, exactly who answered the phone at 3 a.m. and who texted back at 9 to say they were sure it was nothing. My mother visited for holidays and for photographs. Audra brought the children twice a year and posted about it. I do not say that to wound them. I say it because it is the record, and the record matters, because the record is what my mother tried to rewrite in that conference room. One evening, near the end, my grandmother said something I did not fully understand until much later. I had just gotten her settled, and I was sitting in the chair by her bed in the lamplight, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're the only one who comes when there's nothing in it for you." I told her not to talk like that everyone loved her, the things you say. She made a small dismissive sound, the one she made at anything she considered sentimental and false. "I'm not being sad," she said. "I'm being accurate. I've always been able to tell the difference between the people who come for me and the people who come for the house. Go to sleep, Wren." I didn't know it then, but she was telling me she had already done something about it. Because in 2023, 2 years before she died, while she was as lucid and exact as she had ever been in her life, my grandmother had quietly put her affairs in order. I knew only the smallest piece of it at the time. We were at her kitchen table on an ordinary afternoon, and she mentioned, the way she might mention that she had had the gutters cleaned, that she had been into town and settled everything with a good woman, a lawyer. I asked if everything was all right. She waved the question away, and then she said one thing, and she said it while looking directly at me, which she rarely did, so that I would remember it. "I've made it so no one can undo what I want," she said. "Not your mother, not a judge, not even you, if you ever got soft about it." I did not know what to do with that, so I did what you do with the sentences of the elderly that frighten you a little. I let it pass. I poured more tea. I moved us on to something easier. I did not ask to see any documents. It did not occur to me to. I was not there for the documents. I want you to understand that, because the entire story my mother told depended on the opposite being true. I never saw the trust. I never asked what was in it. I knew only that my grandmother had told me I was, in her word, looked after, and I had taken it to mean she had left me something, a keepsake. The reading chair, maybe, the way grandmothers do. What she had actually built, I learned only after she was gone. And I will tell you now, because the room in that conference building did not know it yet, and it is the whole of why the page on the table was never going to be signed. She had not left the house and the account to me in a will, where a will could be contested, where a grieving daughter could stand up in front of a judge and say her mother was confused at the end. She had created an irrevocable trust. The house went into it. The account, just over $460,000, went into it. I was named the successor trustee and the primary beneficiary. And here's the part she built with her own hands, knowing exactly the woman her daughter was. She left my mother a lifetime income from the trust, a set amount every month, and the right to live in the house for the rest of her life if she wished. She did not cut my mother out. She made sure my mother would always have a roof and an income. But she attached one condition, the kind of condition lawyers call a no-contest clause, and it said, in effect, that the day anyone challenged the trust in court, that person forfeited everything the trust had given them. She had built a door that only opened one way, and she had handed me the key without ever telling me what it locked. I have thought a great deal since about the care it took. She was a woman in her 80s with a heart that was failing, and she did not spend her last clear years traveling or resting or doing any of the things people are told to do at the end. She spent some of them driving into town to sit in a lawyer's office above a hardware store and build, piece by careful piece, a structure that would protect a granddaughter from a family she knew too well to trust. She got a capacity assessment so no one could call her confused. She chose 2 witnesses. She wrote a letter in her own hand. She thought about the no contest clause, which is not a thing ordinary people know to ask for, which means she or Lillian sat down and reasoned it through, anticipated the exact move my mother would make, the lawsuit, the accusation, and built the trap so that the move would spring it. That is not the work of a confused woman. That is the work of someone who loved me enough to spend her dying energy making certain that love could not be undone by the people who had spent my life undoing everything else. I did not ask her to do it. I would never have asked. But I think doing it gave her something in those last years, a sense that she could still protect one person who had not had enough protecting. When I sit in her chair now, I think about all those drives into town she made without telling me, and I am undone by them every time. When she died, in November of 2025, I grieved the only member of my family who had ever called me enough, and for about 3 weeks that grief was allowed to be private and clean. Then the terms of the trust surfaced, and the climate changed overnight, the way it always does, the way I had watched it change in the rooms of strangers for 14 years. My mother found out that the estate had come to me, and within days the phone calls began. They were not at first about money. That is never how it starts in the families that are good at this. At first it was about love, and about doing the right thing, and about what my grandmother would have really wanted, as if a woman who had spent good money and 2 years building an unbreakable legal instrument had not made what she wanted exhaustively, permanently clear. My aunt called. A cousin called. The phrase came at me from every direction, worn smooth from use. Do the right thing, Wren, make this right. As if there were a wrong in need of righting, and the wrong was me. I was removed from the family group thread. I found out because a cousin mentioned a Thanksgiving plan I had not been told about. It is a small, almost laughable thing, being removed from a group thread at 36 years old, and it landed in me with a weight I was ashamed of. Because it was so familiar, it was the report card in the drawer all over again, the quiet filing away of the daughter no one had a use for. There was one face-to-face before the lawyers. My aunt arranged it, a lunch at her house, billed as a chance to clear the air, and like the conference room, it turned out to be something else wearing the clothes of something kind. My mother was there, and Audra, and 2 aunts, and when I arrived, the conversation had clearly already happened without me, so that I walked into the middle of a decision rather than the start of one. They had a number. They wanted me to keep a portion, a small one, what they called a fair share for my trouble, and signed the rest back. My aunt used the word trouble as if 6 years of driving out on Tuesdays were an inconvenience I should be compensated for and then dismissed from. My mother did not speak much. She let the aunts do the work, sitting at the head of the table with the wounded dignity of a woman who has been robbed, accepting their indignation on her behalf like a queen accepting tribute. At one point, Audra said, in front of everyone, that it was sick. The word she used, sick, the way I had latched onto an old woman, and an aunt made a soothing sound and no one disagreed, and I sat there with a plate of food I could not eat and felt the room close over me like water. I almost did it. I want to be honest about that. I almost said, fine, keep it, all of it, take it. Because the pressure of a room full of people who have agreed you are guilty is a physical thing. It pushes on your chest, and the oldest part of me, the part that learned at 6 to need as little as possible so as not to be trouble, wanted nothing more than to make them stop looking at me that way. I set down my fork, I said I needed to think, and I left. And I sat in my car in my aunt's driveway, shaking, and I understood that this was the machine, this exact feeling that my whole family had always run on, and that my grandmother, alone among them, had refused to feed it and had built something specifically so that this feeling could never again be used to take from me what was mine. They did not want me to grieve with them. I understood that clearly. They wanted me to grieve alone, out at the edge of the family, until I was tired enough and lonely enough to sign. In February, the letter came. It was from Dennis Frawley on heavy paper, and it used the words undue influence, and it laid out, in the cool grammar of a threat, what a lawsuit would look like. The depositions, the accusation that I had isolated and manipulated a vulnerable adult. The same week, my mother left me a voicemail. I have kept it, though I do not know why. Her voice on it is almost gentle. You can give it back and still be my daughter, she said, or you can keep it and find out what that costs. I listened to it twice, standing in my kitchen, and then I drove out to see Lillian Forsythe. Lillian Forsythe was the good woman in town my grandmother had mentioned, the lawyer who had drafted the trust, and who was named in it as the independent co-trustee, a kind of professional witness and guardrail my grandmother had built into the structure so that I would never be entirely alone with it. Her office was above a hardware store on the main street of the town nearest my grandmother's road, 2 rooms with old wooden floors and a window full of afternoon light, and the first thing she did when I sat down was pour me coffee and let me cry for a minute before she said a single word about the law. Then she laid it out for me, slowly, the way you explain a diagnosis to someone you can see is already overwhelmed. Your grandmother, she said, did not leave you a fight, Wren. I want you to hear that clearly, because I think you walked in here braced for one. She left you the high ground, and she left you a way to never have to use it. She explained the irrevocable trust. The assets were not mine to give, even if I wanted to give them. They were not the estate's to claw back. They sat inside an instrument that had no door my mother could open. She explained the no contest clause. She explained in plain words what would happen the moment my mother actually filed the lawsuit Dennis Frawley was threatening. My mother would forfeit her lifetime income. She would forfeit her right to live in the house. The very act of going to court to take everything would cause her to lose the comfortable, protected thing my grandmother had carefully left her. She's threatening to file a suit, Lillian said. That would, the day it's filed, evict her from the house she's threatening to sue to keep. I don't think her lawyer has explained that to her. Or if he has, I don't think she's believed him. And then Lillian told me about the letter. My grandmother, she said, had left a sealed letter with the trust documents, with an instruction that it was to be opened and read into the record only if anyone challenged the trust. Lillian had not read it. She knew only that it existed and that my grandmother had written it in her own hand and had said, when she sealed it, that it was the rest of the answer if anyone's fool enough to ask the question. I knew, without being told, more or less what was in that letter. I knew it documented things. My grandmother kept records the way I keep charts. I had a fairly good idea, it laid out, in dates and specifics, the long history of how this family had treated me and treated her, the years of absence, the things said, the choices made, all of it dated and exact, the kind of letter that would not just defeat a lawsuit but would end my mother socially, would be read aloud and would follow her through every room she walked into for the rest of her life. I sat in Lillian Forsythe's office with that knowledge, and I understood that I was holding something close to absolute power over my mother, and I want to tell you what it felt like, because it is the center of everything. It felt like nothing I wanted. I had spent my whole life trying to be found innocent by people who needed me to be guilty. And here finally was the proof of my innocence, sealed in an envelope, ready to be detonated. And the strange thing, the thing my 14 years at the bedsides of the dying had taught me without my noticing, was that I no longer needed the verdict. Knowing the letter existed was enough. I did not need to read it into a court record. I did not need to watch my mother's face while it was read. I had imagined that scene for years, in my angrier moments, and now that I could actually have it, I found I did not want it. It would not give me back a single summer. It would only make me a person my grandmother would not have recognized, and worse, a person I would not have wanted my patients to see, because I know what people look like when they are choosing to wound, and I did not want to be wearing that face. So I made a decision in that office, and it was quiet, and no one applauded it because that is how the real decisions are made. I would not weaponize the letter. I would not even pull it from the drawer unless I was forced to, and I hoped I would not be. When the family meeting was proposed, I agreed to go, not to surrender, not to fight either. I would go, and I would let one phone call put the simple truth on the table, and then I would let my mother decide what she wanted to do with a truth she could no longer change. I would bring my grandmother into that room in the form of one phone number, and I would let her finish what she had started, gently, the way she did everything. That is the phone call you heard ringing into the silent conference room, 11 floors up, while my mother's smile came apart in stages. Lillian Forsythe answered on the third ring. "Wren," she said, her voice filling that glass room from the small speaker. "I'm here. Is everyone in the room?" "They are," I said. "My mother's attorney has just asked me to sign a transfer and release. He's mentioned a lawsuit. I thought it would save everyone time if you explained the situation directly to him." There was the smallest pause, and I could picture her in her office above the hardware store, reaching for the file she had no doubt set out in advance, because she had known this day would come the way I had known it. "Of course," she said. "Mr. Frawley, is it? My name is Lillian Forsythe. I'm an attorney, and I'm the independent co-trustee of the Cordelia Ainsley Trust. I'm going to tell you 3 things, and then I'm going to email you the trust summary so your client doesn't have to take any of it on my word. Are you ready?" Dennis Frawley said that he was, and his pleasant voice had gone careful. "First," Lillian said, "the assets your client is asking my co-trustee to sign over are held in an irrevocable trust that was created in 2023. They are not Wren's personal property. She cannot sign them over to anyone. There is no document she can put her name to in that room that would move a single dollar because the assets do not belong to her as an individual. They belong to the trust. So the page in front of her is, I'm sorry to say, meaningless." I watched Dennis Frawley's eyes move to the page on the table, the one with the signature line, and I watched something in his posture begin to change. "Second," Lillian said, "the trust was drafted over a period of months with a capacity assessment on file with 2 independent witnesses by an estate attorney, which is me. Any allegation that Cordelia Ainsley was confused or unduly influenced is going to run directly into a documented, lawyered, witnessed record that says the opposite. I drafted it specifically so that it would survive exactly the kind of challenge your client is contemplating. It will survive it." The room was very quiet. My mother was no longer smiling at all. She was looking at the phone on the table as if it had said something obscene. "And third," Lillian said, and here her voice slowed because this was the one that mattered. "The trust contains a no-contest clause. Your client, Mrs. Atherton, is currently a beneficiary of that trust. She receives a monthly income from it, and she holds a lifetime right to reside in the house. The no-contest clause provides that any beneficiary who challenges the trust in court forfeits everything the trust grants them. So I want to be very clear, Mr. Frawley, for your client's sake. The day you file the suit you're describing, your client loses her income and her home. She would be suing to take a house that she would, by the act of suing, evict herself from. You may want to confirm she understands that she is asking to be evicted." I have replayed the next 30 seconds many times because I have rarely watched a man's whole strategy collapse in real time. Dennis Frawley asked Lillian to send the summary. She said it was already in his inbox. He opened his laptop, and we all sat there while he read, and I watched a professional read a document and understand, line by line, that he had been retained to file a lawsuit that would devastate his own client. He was not a bad man, I think. He was a hired weapon who had been pointed at a target by someone who had not told him the target was her own house. He closed the laptop. He turned to my mother, and he lowered his voice, though everyone could hear him in that small, bright room. "I can't take this any further," he said. "This isn't a case. The trust is sound, and if you contest it, you'll lose the income and the residence. I would be helping you hurt yourself. I won't file this." My mother said his name. Once, the way you would grab someone's sleeve. He shook his head. He began quietly to put his papers back into the leather folder. He was withdrawing, right there, at the table, and the page with the signature line sat between us, untouched, and I understood that the room had finally caught up to the thing I had known when I walked in. There had never been anything for me to sign. My mother turned to me. I think she expected the old machinery to still be there, the levers she had pulled my whole life, the ones that made me small and made me apologize and made me hand over whatever was asked so that the room would stop being uncomfortable. She reached for them and found they were not there. Not because I had taken them away in anger, because they had simply stopped working the way a key stops working in a lock that has been changed. I said the only thing I had come to say. I said it without heat because I did not feel any. I was never going to take the house from you, I told her. I just wasn't going to let you take it from her. She did not understand what I meant. Not then. She heard her, and she thought I meant the house, the structure, the asset. She did not yet understand that I meant my grandmother, that what she had spent 4 months trying to take was not a building. It was the last clear act of love a dead woman had managed to commit, the one provision that said, across the grave, that Wren was the one who came, and that she would not let her daughter undo it. I picked up my phone. "Thank you, Lillian," I said. "I'll call you tomorrow." I ended the call, and I put the phone back in my bag, and I stood up, and I left the page on the table, and I walked out of the room and down 11 floors and into the ordinary afternoon, and no one followed me, and the strangest part was that I did not want them to. I remember the elevator down. It is a strange thing to ride 11 floors alone after a moment like that, the numbers counting down in their small orange light, the cables doing their quiet work, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday carrying you back to the ground while something enormous has just shifted in your chest. I had braced for 4 months for a war. I had imagined courtrooms, depositions, the letter read aloud, my mother's face, and instead it had ended in 11 minutes with a phone call and a man quietly closing his laptop. And there was no triumph in me, only a vast and unexpected tiredness, the tiredness of a body that has been clenched for a long time and is only now beginning to understand that it can let go. When the doors opened, I walked through the lobby and out into the afternoon, and the light was very bright and very ordinary, people eating lunch on a low wall, a man selling flowers from a cart, and I had the disorienting sense that I had walked out of one world and into another that did not know anything had happened. I bought flowers from the cart, I do not know why. Yellow ones. I drove out to the house at the end of the gravel road, and I put them in water in my grandmother's kitchen, and I sat on the porch until it got dark, and that was the whole of my celebration, if you could even call it that. Flowers from a cart and a porch going dark. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first evening in 4 months that no one was trying to take anything from me, and I had forgotten how quiet that kind of evening could be. The lawsuit was never filed. That is how these things actually end, most of the time. Not with a verdict, not with a judge. With a quiet collapse, a story that simply cannot survive contact with the documents, and a family that has to live afterward with having tried. The story my mother had told, the one about the calculating daughter and the confused old woman, began to come apart almost immediately, because stories like that are held together entirely by the absence of facts, and facts had now entered the family. The aunts who had called me to do the right thing learned that there was a no contest clause, and a capacity assessment, and a lawyered trust written 2 full years before my grandmother died, while she was sharp enough to win an argument with any of them. The phrase confused old woman died in their mouths. You cannot call a woman confused once you learn she built a legal instrument specifically designed to outmaneuver the exact people who would later call her confused. And in the wreckage, Audra's part came clear, because it always does. It was my sister, I learned, who had been the engine of the whole thing. She had expected half. In her arithmetic, the estate was a thing owed to the children of Cordelia's daughter, which is to say to her, and the fact that it had gone instead to me, the daughter who had actually been there, registered to her not as a verdict on her absence, but as a theft of her due. She had pushed my mother toward the lawyer. She had wanted me confronted. She had wanted, I think, the conference room itself, the spectacle of it, the formal accusation, because some part of her needed me to be the villain badly enough to build a room around it. She called me after Frawley withdrew, and she was not chastened. That is the thing I keep returning to. She was angry, and the anger had found a new target, which was my restraint. You let her humiliate herself in front of a lawyer, Audra said. You sat there and let it happen, You could have warned her. You could have told her about the clause before she walked into that room. You enjoyed it. I stood in my kitchen, and I felt for a moment the old pull, the lifelong reflex to apologize, to make the discomfort go away, to take the blame because taking the blame was the role I had been assigned at birth. And then I felt it pass, the way a wave you have decided not to fight passes under you and leaves you still standing. No, I said. I let her choose. I didn't make her hire a lawyer. I didn't make her threaten to sue me. She chose all of that, with you whispering in her ear, and the only thing that surprised either of you is that there were consequences you hadn't bothered to read. You don't like what she'd have chosen. That's not the same as me being cruel. Audra said some other things, and then she said the thing that ended it, which was that I had never really been part of this family anyway, and she meant it to wound, and it would have gone in like a blade. But I had spent a lifetime being told that in 100 quiet ways, the report card in the drawer, the seat at the end of the table, the group thread I was removed from, and somewhere along the way the wound had finished forming its scar, and the sentence simply landed against it and slid off. I know, I said. Grandma noticed before I did. That's why we're having this conversation. I hung up. We have not spoken since. I do not expect that we will. I have made my peace with it, which is a strange phrase because the peace is not soft. It is just clear. There was one phone call that went the other way, and I will tell you about it because it is the part I hold on to. It came from Calvin Ortega, my grandmother's neighbor, a man in his 70s who had lived at the next farm down the gravel road for 40 years and had kept an unobtrusive eye on Cordelia and, by extension, on me all those Tuesdays I drove out. He called me about a week after the meeting, and he did not mention the lawyer or the trust because he did not know about any of it and would not have cared. He called to tell me something he thought I should know. Your grandmother told me what she did, he said. More than a year ago. We were out by the fence, and she told me she'd fixed it so the right person got the place. She said, and I remember it because it made me laugh, she said, my Wren is the only one who ever came out here without checking her watch. The rest of them come like they're paying a toll. He paused. I just thought with everything, you should hear that it wasn't a confused old lady. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was proud of it. She wanted you to have somewhere that was yours. I thanked him, and I got off the phone, and I sat down on the floor of my kitchen, which I had not done since I was a child, and I cried in a way I had not let myself cry at the funeral, because at the funeral I had been performing composure for people who were already deciding I was a thief. And here, finally, in an empty kitchen, with an old neighbor's words in my ears, I was simply allowed to be a granddaughter who had lost her grandmother and been seen by her all the way to the end. Being right is cold. I need to tell you that, because the way these stories usually get told, the moment the truth lands is the moment of triumph, the swell of music, the villain's face, and there was a kind of indication I will not pretend there wasn't. But it did not warm me. What warmed me was Calvin Ortega telling me my grandmother had laughed about me by a fence. The legal victory gave me a house. The old man by the fence gave me back the thing the house was only ever a container for. In the weeks after, I spent a lot of time out at the house alone. It was mine now, in the strange way that a trust makes a thing yours. And I would drive out after a shift and let the screen door announce me to no one and sit in my grandmother's reading chair in the lamplight where I had sat with her at the end. And I would let the quiet be quiet. There was an ache in it. I would have traded the whole $460,000 and the house and the porch and the gold field in August for a mother who had simply been glad I existed, with nothing attached. That trade was never on offer. It is, I have come to think, the trade most people in my position are actually grieving underneath the grief about the money. We do not want the estate, we want the parent. The estate proves we never had. I took the sealed letter out of the drawer once. Lillian had given it to me to keep since the contest had never come and it had never needed to be read. I held it under the lamp, my grandmother's handwriting on the front, my name. I knew it was the rest of the answer, the one she had written for anyone fool enough to ask the question. I knew it could still end my mother, even now, even without a courtroom, if I simply made copies and let it find its way to the people whose opinions my mother lived and died by. For about a minute, I let myself imagine it. Then I put it back in the drawer, unopened. I had spent my life trying to be found innocent by people who needed me guilty, and I was finally done auditioning. I did not need the letter read. I did not need the verdict announced. I knew what I knew, and Calvin Ortega knew it, and my grandmother had known it, and that was the only jury whose verdict had ever meant anything. The letter could stay sealed. Letting it stay sealed was not weakness. It was the first thing in this whole story I did purely for myself, because I did not want to be a woman who needed her mother destroyed in order to feel whole. That want had run my life from a distance. I was setting it down. I went to her grave once that spring, alone, with no flowers, because she would have found flowers on a grave foolish, a waste of a living thing on someone past noticing. I just stood there in the wind off the field, in the same churchyard her own parents are in, and I told her out loud what I had decided about the letter and about my mother, the way you talk to the dead. Half embarrassed, certain no one is listening and needing to say it anyway. I told her I was not going to read the letter. I told her I was going to keep her daughter in the house. I half expected to feel her disapproval because she was not a forgiving woman and she might well have wanted the letter read, might have wanted her daughter to face the full accounting. But what I felt instead, standing there, was the particular permission she had always given me, the same one from the porch when I was 9, the sense of being company worth keeping exactly as I was, including this, including the mercy she might not have chosen but would not, I think, have begrudged me. The wind moved the long grass. I stood until I was cold. Then I drove back to the house that was now mine and made tea in her kitchen and sat in her chair. And it was the first time the house felt less like a wound and more like an inheritance in the older sense of the word, the sense that has nothing to do with money, the passing down of a way of being in the world. And then there was the last decision, the one that surprised the few people I told about it. As trustee, I held my mother's monthly income and her right to live in the house in my hands. She had threatened to sue me. She had hired a man to accuse me of preying on a dying woman. By the letter of the trust, had she filed, she would have forfeited all of it. And even though she had not filed, the conduct had been ugly enough that no one would have blamed me for finding a reason to be done with her, to let the relationship and its provisions lapse together. I decided to keep paying her, not because she had earned it, she had not, but because my grandmother had wanted it, had built it into the structure with her own intention, a roof and an income for her daughter no matter what. And I was not going to let the last thing my family did to me turn me into the kind of person who would undo a dead woman's mercy out of spite. My mother keeps her income. She can live in the house, the old one, the smaller one in town that my grandmother also held, for the rest of her life if she wants it. I keep the trusteeship and the clapboard place at the end of the gravel road, the one with the porch and the field, the one that was always mine in every way that mattered before it was ever mine on paper. That is the arrangement. It runs quietly now, the way my grandmother designed it to. There was no eviction, there was no scene, there was no victory lap because I have watched too many people take victory laps over the bodies of their families, and I know how they look from the outside, which is to say, like the loss they think they are celebrating. Odette asked me once why I kept paying my mother, and she did not ask it gently, because Odette has watched me get smaller around my family my whole adult life, and she has no patience left for it. She wanted to know how I could send money every month to a woman who had hired a man to call me a predator. It is a fair question. I have asked it of myself on the drives out. The answer I keep arriving at is this. I did not keep paying my mother for my mother's sake. I kept paying her for my grandmother's and for my own. My grandmother had decided, with full knowledge of exactly who her daughter was, that her daughter would have a roof and an income regardless. And that decision was the last sovereign act of a woman I loved, and I was not going to be the one to overrule it out of injury. And for myself, because I have spent 14 years watching what happens to people who let the worst thing done to them become the blueprint for who they become next. They harden into a shape they did not choose. The cruelty wins twice that way. Once when it is done to you, and again when it remakes you in its image. I was not going to give it the second win. So the check goes out. Not as forgiveness, which I have not managed and may never manage, but as a fence I built around the kind of person I refuse to become. I split my weeks now between the ward and the porch. Odette comes out sometimes on our days off, and we sit on the steps and shell peas. Badly. Neither of us any good at it, and laugh about it, and the screen door announces the wind. Calvin Ortega waves from his fence line. My patients and the families who circle their rooms go on teaching me every week the thing I keep having to relearn, which is that people show you who they are at the end, and that the showing is a kind of gift, even when it costs you because it tells you where to stand. My mother and I do not speak. The door there is not slammed. I want to be honest about that because it would be cleaner to tell you I cut her off, and I did not. I just stopped walking toward a door that has been locked my whole life, stopped knocking on it, stopped waiting on the step for it to open. She knows where I am. The income arrives every month on time, the small, steady proof that I am not the person she said I was. If she ever wants to walk through the door from her side, it is not bolted. But I am not going to spend the years I have left standing in front of it. And there is a difference, an enormous difference, between leaving a door open and living on the step in front of it. I lived on that step for 37 years. I have come inside now. I have come inside to a house where I was always company worth keeping. So let me tell you the one thing this left me with, in case you are standing on a step of your own. If the people who are supposed to be your family only call you family when you are handing something over, that was never family. That was a bill. The love was always invoiced, and the invoice always came due at the worst moment, at the funeral, at the bedside, at the reading of the will, and you have spent your life paying it because you thought paying it was what love was. It is not. You are allowed to stop paying it. You are allowed to keep the thing that was freely given to you by the one person who gave freely, and you are allowed to do it without becoming cruel, without the letter, without the courtroom, without the speech. Quiet is allowed. Mercy is allowed, even toward the people who showed you none. Because the mercy is not for them. It is for you. It is how you walk out of the room still wearing your own face, and walking away from a locked door is not the same as being locked out. I know it feels the same, in the dark, when you are young and it is your mother's door, but it is not the same. One of them is a punishment. The other one, the one where you turn around and walk back up your own gravel road to your own lit window, that one is the first free thing you will ever do. The field past the porch is going green again. My grandmother is out there in it somewhere, in the way the people who saw us stay out in the things they loved. I'm going to sit here a while longer, where it is quiet, where I was always enough. Good night, and be gentle with yourself. You owe that door nothing. Come inside.